Hello, everyone, and welcome to Naturalist Notes, Friends of the Dunes webinar series. Thank you for being here on this lovely Wednesday evening. My name is Susie Fortner. I'm the Programs and Operations Director for Friends of the Dunes. My pronouns are she and her.
Hello, everyone. I'm Daisy Embris Perez, and I'm the Outreach Manager for Friends of the Dunes. My pronouns are she, her.
Okay, I think we have a few more people joining, but we're just going to go ahead and get started. We're really excited about our presentation this evening. I would like to start by acknowledging that the coastal environments Friends of the Dunes is working to conserve are located in the unceded territory of the Wiyot people, which includes the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. Wiyot people continue to be stewards of the diverse ecosystems surrounding Wigi, the Humboldt Bay, as they have been since time immemorial, including the Wadalk coastal dunes located between Wigi and Shore, the Pacific Ocean. One of the ways in which we can honor our placement within Wiyot territory is by acknowledging the original names of these places, plants, and animals in Sula Tulak, the Wiyot language. These are names that existed long before the violent colonization of this area and attempted erasure of indigenous cultures and knowledge. For each webinar, we are introducing a Wiyot word of the day, and today's word is tapav, bumblebee. And thanks for bearing with me in those pronunciations. That LH sound is actually kind of a hissing between a TH and an SH sound that I keep practicing because it's difficult for me to make that noise. It's not part of the English language normally. So if you would like to learn more about words in Sulak Tuluk, the Wiyot language, there are some great resources, including audio files and pronunciations on the Wiyot tribe's website, which is wiyot.us. I am joining you from Jarojiji or Eureka. I would love to hear in the chat where everybody is tuning in from and the ancestral lands if you know them. Please remember to toggle that blue button on your chat box to include both panelists and attendees. Oh, that's still me, sorry. So in case you're new to our webinar series and to Friends of the Dunes, Friends of the Dunes is a nonprofit organization dedicated to conserving the natural diversity of communities, or excuse me, it's the natural diversity of coastal environments through community-supported education and stewardship programs. We also manage this beautiful interpretive facility, the Humboldt Coastal Nature Center, which is finally open to the public again as of today. Today was our first day to reopen since March 2020, so we're pretty excited about that. This webinar series is a fundraiser for our coastal naturalist training. So all the proceeds raised from this webinar series go towards scholarships for the coastal naturalist training, which is a California Naturalist certification program that takes place in the fall. It will be starting on September 9th and going through October 28th.
So more big news, the dune ecosystem restoration team is back. So our work days are back and we're resuming on an RSVP basis at the Malel Dunes South. And soon we will be resuming these work days at our Humboldt Coastal Nature Center. So if you're interested in volunteering to remove invasive non-native plants from our dunes, you can sign up by visiting friendsofthedunes.org/volunteer, and you can fill out the questionnaire linked on our website. Yeah, and thank you everyone for joining us for Friends of the Dunes on our very first webinar. We have one more to go after this one today, so make sure you tune in for that. It's going to be really interesting. We're going to learn some stuff about climate change, and yeah, so really, really interesting. So I'm just going to go over a quick couple of quick housekeeping items. Please feel free to communicate amongst yourselves in the chat. As Susie mentioned, make sure that you toggle who you're sending the message to by clicking on the blue button in the chat box. If you have questions for the presenter, please write them in the Q&A rather than in the chat box. That makes it easier for us to find those questions at the end of the presentation. And if you want to control your view of the presentation, you can do that by clicking on the little control button in your right corner. Last but not least, these webinars will be recorded and we will send you a link to the video within a few days.
Yeah, and just want to add to this that we are recording all of these sessions. So if you like this one and you want to see more of them, it's not too late to register for the full series, and we will send you the passwords to those videos so you can access the webinars that already happened. And without further ado, I would like to welcome our presenter for this evening, Introduction to Native Bees of the Dunes. And Brian Dykstra is a instructor with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. He's the founder of the Native Bee Society, and he is a farmer at a bee-friendly farm in Willow Creek. And we go way back. Brian and I actually used to be docents together, Share the Beach docents, a long time ago. So I think that's where we originally met. So thanks for being here, Brian. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share.
Thanks for the introduction, Susie. That was fun. I wish perhaps I'll find the recording of the snowy plover presentation to see how that went. I hope that was fun for everybody. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about native bees of the dunes, and I'll just jump right into it. And I have some photos of my own and photos of some other people's to share to help tell with the images. So I'm going to share the screen I have. And here we go. This is Introduction to Native Bees of the Dunes. And what I want to emphasize is that bees are really diverse. And that's going to be the theme here, because we're going to learn the commonalities and the differences between the different ways bees live, including what's special on the dunes. But we're going to learn that bee diversity is like a source of strength, insurance, abundance, and bee diversity is essential for what the dune ecosystem is with the plants and the animals. So when you think of the flowers and the flora of the dunes, we think of different shapes, sizes, and colors, especially with the restored areas. So we think of different phenologies. Some things bloom in the spring and midsummer, or in the fall, or even in the winter. We think of different habitats they might live in, places they prefer, and slope or aspect or proximity to the ocean. So here's some examples of plants in their habitat and all their differences and similarities. We can think of bees in the same way, because bees vary in shape and size and in color and phenology, the time of year they're out and how long they're active, how they nest or forage, where they live, where else they live in the world, or in California or the Pacific coast, the flowers they like to visit, they can vary. And of course, their ability to pollinate those flowers is not the same across all the different bees. So there was a Friends of the Dunes contest for people to do some art regarding solitary bees. And this is a second place award winner here about how the blue orchard bee is shy. And that's something that also, when we think of bees, we can think of how their behavior can be really different. And maybe our approach to them could consider the fact that maybe they don't always want our attention. In fact, often when I use the term bee, really, or bees, people think of honeybees and the associated things like stings colonies, honey, hives, swarms, queen bees, living in a big colony. But as you saw that nice art there, many bees, most bees are so shy. You have to pay attention to them. They're not really paying attention to you. So perhaps our mental map of the word bees could be expanded. Just like when we think of the word flower, we could go a lot of different places with that word. We need to do that with the word bee. So the map, our mental map, is not necessarily the territory at all. Here's another art work from this sixth grader, first place, which indicates that solitary bees do not live in colonies, produce honey, or have a queen. So you see some of the nice bees in their habitat there. So what does it mean to be a solitary bee? The fact that they don't live in colonies, they don't live in large groups, means the bee that's building the nest is the same bee that's also responsible for foraging for pollen and nectar, and is the same bee that lays the eggs, and there's no other bee that helps her do those things. So there is no group of bees, and if she was to be upset, there's no other bees that are going to back her up with stinging, unlike a honeybee. But these bees, they can come in different sizes, and I wanted to emphasize that, as I mentioned, their diversity. So here's a bee on a California poppy, and compare that in scale on a similar sized poppy flower. To this one here, you can see it there at the bottom, living in a nest. We could consider that mother bee may only be coming and going a few times from that nest in a day. She may be very small in the flower that you're looking at, and she may fly a lot quicker than a bumblebee or honeybee that you think of seeing as a bee. So it's harder to recognize that they're out there unless you slow down and smell the flowers. It's a bee that's on the, you can see close up here, the coloration on her thorax is very, very, bees are beautiful beings. And as I mentioned, that one bee that's collecting the nectar island for her babies, that's a female bee. So that is the mother bee. She's the one who does the work.
Okay, we seem to have lost Brian's.
Hey, I'm back again. Can you hear me?
Okay, it kind of froze on your screen there. So
Okay.
looking at a pretty bee photo, but you're back. That's good.
Were we looking at a mother bee on a yellow flower?
Yes, I believe that's where we were at. We had just gotten past the poppy one, but it kind of started freezing right around the poppy.
Oh, geez. Okay. Well, then I will start that. I'll start sharing the screen there.
Great. I'm so glad you made it back.
Okay. Slideshow from current slide. So here's that smaller size bee on the California poppy, emphasizing how different they can be in size compared to the previous one we see here. It can make them hard to see, considering they're so small, and they may be coming from a tiny nest that she's only coming and going a few times a day. So she may be busy, but it doesn't become as apparent to you as a hive of honeybees, which has maybe 50,000 coming and going from the same entrance. So here's a colorful thorax of one of the bees found out in the dunes. This is a Lasioglossum, emphasizing the different colors. This bee shows that she's carrying pollen on her legs. She's the mother bee. It is female bees who do the work building the nest, collecting food for the young. The male bees don't do any of that. So when they're out there collecting pollen, the pollen is sticking onto hairs on the bee, and different bees can have different types of hairs. All bees will have some branched hairs on their body, as shown in this diagram. The branching can really vary, but the pollen grains can stick on those branches, and then they'll comb that off. How bees carry pollen varies too. They may carry it on the bottom of their belly, as you see on the upper left, on their legs, as you see on the right, or packed tightly on their legs in a pollen basket, like you see in the bottom left and right. So these are different ways of carrying pollen. The scope on the top are, that's Italian for broom. They're loosely packed pollen areas, which have the branch, often will have branched hairs, whereas the pollen baskets, the pollen is pressed tightly and becomes moistened with nectar. So here you see, this is to scale. The corbicula can be very tiny. It actually is Greek for a very tiny agricultural gathering basket. Maybe it's easier to say corbicula. So here's a honeybee. She's begun filling her basket with pollen. And you can see it's a very non-hairy region. It's concave, and it's ringed with hairs on the side, like a tall basket right there. Bumblebees have the same way. You can see the flat, or it's concave, but relatively smooth area surrounded by long hairs right there. That is where she'll fill the pollen for carrying back. As opposed to other bees that carry it loose, like this one on her belly. This is the scopa. So that's Italian for broom, because it's like a broom. Scopae can be on legs, like you see in this Anthophora, where it's filled with pollen. You don't see a very defined edge there because the pollen hasn't been packed tight. It's been pushed into the hairs. So here's a bee that hasn't filled up her scopae with pollen yet, but you can see her hairy legs. So we know that this is not a bumblebee or a honeybee because she's not carrying it in that very tiny agricultural gathering basket known as a corbicula. As you've seen this picture before, this picture turned out a little better. Even these blurry pictures allow us to see some of the unique aspects of bee biology. I held this flower still in the wind so I could look. I knew right away what kind of bee this was because I could see the way she was carrying pollen, and she was holding still for me. Loose pollen. This bee carries pollen on the bottom of her belly. You can see the hair underneath her abdomen. And she's a leafcutter bee. That's a common name, Megachile. Here's a higher definition photo. You can see her a hairy scopa underneath her abdomen right there. There's one that's filled with pollen. You see this genus out on the dunes, and we'll get to this, the one that lives out in the dunes. This is an osmia. Some people call them mason bees. And she's got a lot of pollen on her abdomen as well. And here is a leafcutter bee with her belly just loaded with pollen. Here's one out on the dunes, and she's getting pollen all over her body. She's going to brush it off her body and put it on her belly for carrying back to the nest. So some bees are very specific about what kind of pollen they like to gather for their children, and some are not. So as you can see in this award-winning art submitted to the Friends of the Dunes, Lasioglossum are bees that will visit multiple species of plants to gather pollen. This bee, however, is more specific. This is Megachile wheeleri, and what's known as being oligolectic. This bee is only going to gather pollen from members of the sunflower family. So that includes two common species in restored dunes, the Erigeron glaucus and Solidago spathulata. This is a seaside daisy and the dune goldenrod. So her children will have a fairly specific diet. Only members of the sunflower family will provide the pollen for her for the next generation. This is another bee that uses a specific group of pollens. She also uses the sunflower family. So she'll be using those special sunflower family members from the dunes. Here's a close-up of that genus. And you can see her hind legs are filled with pollen. They can get very covered in pollen, but you have to catch them in that moment because they'll comb that off and carry it back to their nest. So this is the silver dune bee going to the beach pea. And she's carrying pollen on her legs. You can see, here's another picture by Kim McFarland of the same species. She's got her hairy hind legs for collecting pollen. And while they'll collect pollen from other plants, their phenology times out really well with the beach pea. So it ends up providing a large amount of the pollen they provide for their young. This is a queen bumblebee, and she is drinking nectar at the beach pea. And later in the year, her daughters may be visiting later blooming flowers, as you see here, the beach buckwheat. There are also bees that live on the dunes that do not collect pollen for their children because they'll lay an egg in another bee's nest and expect that their children will be eating the pollen provisioned by a different mother bee. So these are called cuckoo bees, just like some birds will lay an egg in another bird's nest and say, thanks for taking care of my baby bird when it hatches. Cuckoo bees function like that and look for the nest of another bee, and they'll lay an egg in there, perhaps right on the pollen provision. Bees are really diverse in how they nest and where they nest. So you can see, of course, in the dunes, some of these bees are going to be nesting directly in the sand, in the sandy environment. In fact, most bees in the world are ground nesting bees. But just as most bees are solitary bees, that is like single hardworking mom bees, those nests in the ground may seem like an abandoned ant hole, or you may not even notice it as a nest because there is not a colony of bees pouring out and in from that entrance. It's one bee. So this is one of the silver dune bees, and she's digging a nest that is like underneath one of the coastal artemisias. And yeah, I got a special opportunity to see her digging that nest. They can be more than 1 meter deep, which is pretty amazing. So they choose the sandy environments that have the capacity for those type of nests where it won't collapse. So they're looking for more hard packed areas, but they're also looking for areas that it's hard to, there may be loose sand up top. They may redo the entrance, every day, but the hard pack will be underneath. So an example of some of the nesting diversity. Okay, there's her nest entrance if you couldn't see.
Okay, I think Brian froze again. Brian, if you can hear us, we're looking at a silver bee hole. Unfortunately, guys, I don't know much about bees, but I do know that these bees in particular have been nesting out at Samoa Dunes and Wetlands Conservation Area and been able to see some pretty cool sightings of those bees out there recently. I am hoping that Brian comes back on.
Yeah, back on.
Okay, we were looking at the silver bee digging the hole under the Artemisia.
Okay, wow. It's okay. I get practice. I get to practice a few minutes ahead and come back to it. I'm sorry that my internet connection is or it must be. It's very windy here. I'm in Willow Creek. That's where I am at. It's very windy. So I'm gonna get my screen sharing again and go back to the silver bee. Let's see, right there. So after the silver bee, I mentioned that there are some bees that are semi-social. So rather than living in a large colony, there may be only 2 or 3 bees that will share duties and provisioning for the young. And some members of the Halictidae are like that. So here you see a bee coming back with pollen on her legs, and the little nest entrance, there's a little guard bee making sure it's only a family member who's coming back. Of course, these bee nests under the ground, they end up being provisioned with pollen and nectar, and then a little, the egg hatches and a little grub is eating that good stuff. And that becomes a snack for all kinds of animals, whether it's foxes or skunks. They may dig down to find the tasty treats in there, and it's a pretty common occurrence. There are bees in other areas that nest on the dunes here in California that build little turrets of mud, like you see here. We don't have them on our dunes, but if you go a little farther south in California, you can find some of the Ammophila bomboides that make these unique nest entrances. That these chimneys basically help regulate the temperature and humidity inside the nest. Example of the nesting diversity. But here on the dunes, we do have the leafcutter bee that I mentioned before that is oligolectic, that only uses pollen of the sunflower family and really likes the dune goldenrod. It prefers that dune goldenrod for nest making material. And this bee, she'll nest underground. She will choose a spot where she can basically make a straw of leaf material. And she'll cut out oval pieces with her mandibles from the leaves and use that to make the lengthwise portion of the straw. And then she'll provision pollen and nectar, lay an egg, and then she'll make a wall within that straw shape. And she'll make that wall out of a few pieces of that circular leaf pieces that she cuts. She cuts them to size, given the space she's nesting in. And that helps protect her young from the elements, the rain and mold, as well as predators, little wasps, ants that might want to come in and eat her provisions or eat her babies. So this is what we're seeing here. So you can find, even if you can't get a bee to hold still for your photos or don't even see a bee that day, this is a lot like finding animal tracks on the sand. You can find evidence that the bees were there, that they've been out there building nests, likely very close by. They may collect the materials a little away from where their nests are, but a lot of these native bees, maybe fly, a few hundred feet away from their nests, not multiple miles. Some bees even use petals. Some Megachile bees, even if they're called leafcutter bees by many of them use other materials, such as this farewell to spring flower petal. I found this nest once that sometimes bees will macerate the leaves into like a mash, a pulpy mash, and use that to surround their nest. This one, however, fell out of a tree. It was attached to a leaf, but the leaf fell, and then it broke open. You see the pollen provision inside there, and the wall that was built around it, made out of macerated leaf pieces. There's a bee that nests out in the dunes that makes its nest out of the woolly hairs or trichomes, all that fuzz you find on the beach, the dune buckwheat. This is an Anthidium you saw earlier with pollen on her belly. And there are bees that will nest not underground using nest material out of plants, but these bees will use old stems. This is a picture of a blackberry stem with a Seratina bee inside. However, on the dunes, the Seratina acantha species prefers to nest in dune goldenrod stems. Old stems, when left, provide a great spot for these little bees to excavate the pith and move inside. And one of my favorites is the Colletus. This is a genus of bees. They make a special kind of basically a cellophane, like it's the only naturally produced kind of cellophane like polymer. It's waterproof, and they tend to use a really soupy mixture of pollen and nectar inside there, which it doesn't leak because it's waterproof. And then they lay an egg attached to the side. And when the egg hatches, the baby bee starts drinking that soupy mass that has a lot of good living probiotics inside of it for nutrition. And it drinks itself down to the bottom as it grows. Well, these nests, they're waterproof from the inside out, but also from the outside in. So these nests can be submerged in, bodies of standing water for months at a time. Some of the other bees can too, but Colletus is really good at that. And this is a picture of one of the Fish and Wildlife Service specimens of the Colletus that nests out on the dunes. Perhaps superficially resembling a honeybee, but when you look at some of the wing venation, and especially when you look at how she'll carry pollen on her hairy legs, you'll see it's different than the corbicula of the honeybee. So here's the honeybee nest, right? Pretty obvious to find a honeybee nest when you found it, I guess. Okay, but I do want to talk about invasive species that affect bees, native bees on the dunes. European beach grass is one. It produces pollen. Bees will use grass pollen. It's really their least preferred option, and grasses do not provide nectar. And bees need both pollen and nectar to provision for their young. Yellow-bush lupin, that becomes a dominant species and really destroys some of the open community that allows that plant diversity. And then ice plant does the same. It kind of smothers all that plant diversity, which then reduces the bee diversity. And so here's an example of ice plant flowers with honeybees visiting. Honeybees visit the bush lupin. They visit this one. In fact, we see them a lot. I should mention that honeybees are not native on the dunes. They're not native in California. They were brought to California around the early 1850s. So they haven't been here that long, especially compared to the longstanding relationships between the bees and the native plants that are, hundreds of thousands of years old in the area, millions. So this is some USDA research, and you can watch. This is a little screenshot from a YouTube video, which is based on an academic paper published by the USDA Agricultural Research Service Insect Research Unit by Jim Kane, in which they try to understand how much pollen is withdrawn by honeybee hives. So in the beekeeping world of European honeybees, people understand that for a hive, you have like what's called a hive unit month, or a hum, and you have to have that much pollen and nectar out there or for that month, or you have to supplemental feed them. So they looked at how much pollen is consumed by honeybees, and they found that every 100 hives removes the amount of pollen that basically, and nectar that would produce about 10 million native bees, because native bees require a little less pollen per bee, and there is a lot of bees, honeybees, in a hive. So what does this mean? when it comes to our native bees, basically there can be competition. In addition to the honeybees preferring to visit the non-native plants, when they visit native plants, they're visiting finite resources. We all know that there could be more native plants. And we all know that honeybee keepers feed, sugar water or artificial, protein to keep their bees alive through the winter. So they have these artificially large numbers. People buy them, they bring them places. These are amounts of bees that are not related to what the ecosystem is already providing. So if you're considering helping bees out in the dunes, maybe don't put your honeybees by the dunes, because keeping honeybees to save the bees could be akin to keeping cows to help ungulates in general. One is native and one is not native. The cows are not native here. Even John Muir described the honeybee as sweet-winged cattle. So I'm not the first person to make that analogy. Of course, comparing a native bee that is native, perhaps it could be threatened, endangered, or rare. So we have, or unique to the very specific ecosystem, such as the dunes, compared to the honeybee, which is not unique to the dunes, has no loyalty to any particular plant there. It's commercially available and is abundant simply because it's commercially produced. So when we look at the literature about our dunes, way back when, the Friends of the Dunes was including native bees in their coastal naturalist training books. It's been great. But even recently, we look at, how people look at wildlife. Often bees are not included in our assessments of wildlife and our discussions about wildlife. So this report, for example, had no mention of bees whatsoever. June 2020, no mention of bees. But if we look at this one here from 2019, it did mention bees, and I think that's great, because the more we talk about bees and how they live and their importance to the ecosystem, the better we can be at protecting them as a unique resource that's available nowhere else. So in this book, in this paper, they mentioned that over 40 species of native solitary bees are playing an important role in the plant diversity and ecosystem functioning. And I've got just a couple quotes here. I know the words look boring, but they really mean something up here. So there's a strong tendency for apis to frequently introduce flowers. This is specifically about coastal nature preserves. Apis, European honeybee, may be of limited value in maintaining populations of native plants. Same paper. And honeybees are abundant at Arcata dunes due to nearby apiaries in feral populations. So on that note, let's look at the native bee abundance and species richness are positively correlated with intact native dune vegetation. This is from a HSU thesis by Laura Julian. Native bees are crucial to the survival of our native dune mat community from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And maintaining pollinator populations should be a conservation goal. And we need to consider native pollinator populations and include them in native plant restoration programs. This is from a great paper called Interactions Among the Bee and Plant Communities in Coastal Dunes and the Implications for Conservation Biology. We've known for a long time how important these native bees are. And so when we come up with what we're gonna do at the beach, we're gonna hike down the trail, we're gonna go flag height, we're gonna ride an off-road vehicle, here in Humboldt, are we gonna make a new parking lot or road? We can think about where these native bees nest. Think of them just like other forms of wildlife or plant communities. Perhaps they nest somewhere where we could protect. And in our restoration activities, recognizing how beneficial they are to bring native plants in, we can also consider the best way to do that. Is it bulldozing? Is it prescribed fire? Is it hand pulling? What can we reseed and replant, and how will that help the native bees help them? Because the plants and the bees are supporting each other's future, supporting each other's children in that process. I want to share a resource with you before we get to the Q&As. There's a pictorial guide to bees of Humboldt Bay Dunes by Susan Nyoka, and this is online. You can see the website up top there. It's a great resource. This is what it looks like on the front page. You can learn how to recognize bees from other types of insects. You can look at some of the common bee species in the dunes. And it's a great way to familiarize yourself before you go out and on a bee hunt out there. You know, if I was to draw one more analogy between honeybees, I guess I have it on here. Between birds and chickens and honeybees and native bees, you know, keeping honeybees to save the bees is like keeping chickens to save the birds. In other words, it doesn't directly help the locally adapted native species and their relationships with those native plants. You know, some are native, threatened, endangered, or rare, and have unique relationships with the ecosystem, and others are around because we've used them as a society, and we keep them in higher abundance than they would be if they were actually wild creatures. You know, they wouldn't, you know, if they were only just wild creatures, regardless of native or not, they would not be as abundant as they are because of our commercial raising of them. So I can talk more about bees, but I definitely want to get to your questions and answers, or your questions, perhaps my answers if I know the answer. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'll look in the question and answer section, and maybe I'll in the screen share.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. That's so much great information about bees. And yeah, I think that, you know, we have a lot of great questions already. If other folks have questions they want to ask Brian, go ahead and type them into the Q&A. I really thought that was, I guess I have never thought of honeybees in the way that you're presenting it, of comparing them to cattle and to chickens and things, but that completely makes sense. So yeah, I appreciate that perspective. Okay, we're gonna kick it off. If you wanted to stop your screen share, then we could have just our videos up. Yep. And let's ask you some questions. Okay, a good one from Natalia. Would you be willing to give a bee walk in the dunes?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
Well, we'll have to set that up sometime soon.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I want to sign me up. I'll be the ambassador. So Christian asks, roughly how many offspring can these solitary bees produce?
The offspring produced depends on a variety of factors, including how much pollen and nectar they can provision during the season. So, you know, if habitat's destroyed, or if the pollen and nectar has been removed by other bees, for example, they'll have less to provision for their young, and they'll have less young. But given a normal situation, excluding something drastic, because there's gradual decline in habitat quality and and gradual competition, and then there's drastic. Let's say things are normal. A lot of these bees are probably going to have between 5 and 15. It really depends. Since there's so many species, it's really hard to pinpoint, especially given different habitats. One bee may provision 2 young, and then she might be eaten or hit by a car. These things happen. So they work really hard to provision for their young, but it's a small number compared to a queen bee whose her only thing is laying eggs, for the most part. So she's laying eggs all day, and all day the next day. She's not building the nest, going out foraging to the flowers, coming back, doing all those things. So a lot less than honeybees, and that makes it, so I guess say a dozen or less typically. That said, I should say, bumblebees are a eusocial bee, and their colonies because they'll live in colonies, can be, you know, anywhere between, well, they start at one with the mother bee, the queen bumblebee, and her children will start foraging for her. Once she's raised them, the first few, they'll forage for her, and then she can stay at home and just lay eggs and take care for the young, and she won't be doing any more foraging. And so those colonies start out at one, and then they reach, you know, I don't know, the high end, maybe a couple hundred around here. It's hard to say. I haven't, you know, I can't look at all their colonies, but they have like what's like a more of like an annual cycle. The queen bee overwinters somewhere underground. She's mated in last summer or last fall. She's waiting underground by herself, just in like a torpor. She's like hibernating in a sense, I guess, if you want to say it, like, you know, like a mother bear or something. You know, you don't see her. And then in the springtime, she emerges, and you see them doing this back and forth, left to right, you know, looking for a place to nest. And they're much bigger than the worker bees, that the young bees, the non-reproductive females she'll have. But and she's going back and forth. She'll find like an old rodent burrow or some sort of underground cavity to start making wax pots and fill them with, you know, pollen and nectar. She'll lay eggs, and she'll keep those baby bumblebees warm. And when they actually hatch out, they'll become foragers, and she'll stay back in the colony and just kind of lay eggs and stuff. So then the foragers then are smaller. So those colonies, you know, she's having more than just, you know, a dozen or less per year. She's having more. But at the end of the summer or somewhere in the summer, she'll stop laying eggs. She'll lay the what will be the new queens and males, and they'll go out and find each other from other colonies, mate, and then it will be just the mated females that will overwinter by themselves to start their own colony next year. So I should say that. So there are some native bees out there that are having more than just a dozen bees in a year. So.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it sounds like a complicated answer. Depends on the bee.
Yeah.
So we got another question here from Natalia. Bees are quite small and can sometimes be confused with flies and killed. Do you have a tip to distinguish them from flies?
A tip for us, people without microscopes attached to our eyes. Yeah, what would we do? How do we know? So a fly will eat pollen, you know, a fly will go for something sweet on your table, etc. You know, a fly will go for meat on your table. Bees aren't going to go for meat at your picnic. Bees might go for something sweet if they don't have any nectar to go to. But when they're on a flower, bees, while they may eat pollen, for the most part, female bee is going to collect that pollen off the flower. So behavior is a great way. Hope you continue to see me think. Short antenna, or flies typically have only a few segments of antenna. Typically those antennae that are much, maybe you can see me. Can you wave if you see me or hear me? Hi. So looking for the shorter antenna and the fact that they are not collecting pollen on purpose.
Thank you. You did freeze up a little bit there, but you came back, and I think we got the answer. So
Awesome. Okay.
Okay, sorry. So, my question went away. Okay, so Christian asks, so it sounds like supporting local honey is actually pretty harmful for native species. Is that correct?
It's a broad question for, you know, a diverse world. You know, itself, when it's very not native, comes from floral resources. And so if you're buying local honey, you're buying nectar, and supporting bees that have collected pollen. You're supporting the blackberry egar thistle honey that's supporting the star thistle ecosystem. And a lot of the same characteristics between these invasive non-native plants here in California, whether it's English ivy, or the Himalayan blackberry, they're related. There's a reason why they both have the kind of invasive potential. People like to put them in their yard. Oh, that's great. I'll put English ivy in my yard, so we artificially supplement them in new areas. And they also have a tendency to take over. They don't have any qualms about doing that. So, I think recognizing what they're doing, the flora resources are limited and they're ever changing. So the ecosystems will change based on the pollinator abundance. And coming to someone's future question here regarding when the native plants are abundant and when they're not, how do bees, match up with that, with the phenology? With honeybees, because people because they're not native here, their colony buildup is based on sugar, solution or whichever. So they can have suddenly a lot of foragers, and it has nothing to do with thousands of years of adapting to when floral resources are environmentally available. So suddenly they may have a large population, and there may not be a lot of blackberry blooming, star thistle, or English ivy. So they'll go to almost anything, and that does really crater resources for native bees. And native bees are more adapted to the environmental conditions of when the floral resources are abundant. That's when they'll have the most activity or the biggest population. So even if you go take Italian honeybees and bring them to an island in Greece, they don't have the same adaptations that the native subspecies of honeybee has in Greece to adapt to the local flora. So there's a real mismatch, and so it tends to shift in the pollination ecosystem to support non-native plants. The science has been pretty solid on that, in terms of that there's competition between honeybees and native bees, and that it shifts the ecosystem towards non-native plants in most situations that have been studied.
Okay, thanks. You were breaking up a little bit during that answer too, but I think we did.
Oh, darn.
You came back. It was just at the very
okay.
Okay.
What's not a bit important?
Okay, let's see. So, sorry, I should have my question ready. So from Mike Zibra, I've heard that carpenter bees are new to this area. Are they competing with native bees?
I'm not sure that carpenter bees are native or new to the area. And I'm not sure which kind of carpenter bee you mean. There are carpenter bees that are large carpenter bees in the genus Xylocopa, and they can excavate in dead wood and build their nest in there. And then there are the tiny carpenter bees, the Serratina bees. Like I said, they maybe are excavating pith out of a dune goldenrod, and provisioning for their the next generation in those tiny nests. I think some of the there are non-native Serratina bees that have been brought to the U.S. because simply they can arrive in like old stems and nursery plant material and that kind of thing. And we move around dead plants all the time, with our global society. So I'm not sure.
Mike, he clarified in the chat that he meant the large carpenter bees.
Perhaps, they are a bee that is typically found farther south. They are found as far north as Eugene and farther north than that, Eugene, Oregon. But they become less abundant as you go north. They become more abundant and diverse as you go south here. So there's so I'm not sure which species or which location you're at. So it's a good question. I don't have all the answers for that.
Thank you.
It's certainly a species that could be transported in some lumber or something, and there's multiple species, I should say, but as a genus, they can be moved pretty easily.
Lots of different types of bees. So Steph Morian asks, how do you approach a bee if you'd like to get a closer look? I saw that someone was holding a bee in a picture.
Sure. Yeah, I hold lots of bees. I've had kids holding bees. I've taught like summer programs where kids get to hold bees because there's ways to do it safely. I had a nice slide about great ways to observe bees. But if I go into it here, do you need a net? No, you probably could just use the internet to help identify something. Because if you use the camera,
Okay, looks like Brian's frozen again, unfortunately. I'm gonna wait a second. Hope that Brian unfreezes to answer the rest of our bee questions.
I really wanted to know about that camera.
Yeah, my answer to that question was going to be very carefully. Okay, Brian is still frozen. We'll give it another second and see if he's able to unfreeze. Now it's just me and Daisy. Such good information about bees, and I'm kind of bummed that the internet's not working great. But if there's unanswered questions here, I will, what I'll do is I'll take a screenshot of these questions and make sure to ask them to Brian in an email. And Brian's back. Yay. Okay.
I'll shut my video down to make it easier, maybe to not lose the reception. You can just throw a question at me. It's okay. I don't know where I wasn't online anymore. I realized no one else was moving.
Yeah, you kind of froze there. You were answering the question about approaching the bees for a closer look. And you had said if you have a camera, I think that's where you kind of cut out.
Yeah, cameras are great. Bees, like if you play like a 30 frames per second movie, for me, I guess I'm convinced it's live action, like it's really happening. It's not boring. I'm not like, next slide, please. Like I see the person standing there halfway to the door. Okay. It's like, it looks like someone walked all the way to the door, the whole thing. But bees see 300 or more frames per second, if we're trying to make an analogy of how many frames per second they're seeing. So if they watched a movie, they would get bored. They would feel like they're seeing the same picture forever, so they see tiny movements really easily. They're very sensitive creatures. They can sense the electromagnetic frequency of a flower and what is communicating about the amount of pollen or type of pollen. So if you move, they sense it. So being still, being like a plant, being still, if you cast a shadow over them, if you're trying to get close, they're more likely to leave. But if you approach so that you don't cast a shadow on them and go slow, and I think lack of fear is something you could have. Own that. This is a bee visiting a flower in this scenario. They're interested in that flower. And if you can tell if it's a honeybee or bumblebee versus any other kind, does it have pollen in a scopa or does it have pollen in a corbicula? If you see either of those, okay, then it's a bee. If it's in a scopa, the broom, then you know it is a solitary bee or semi-social. It's basically that bee doesn't even have any others in a group that would want to attack you. Because it's a single hardworking mom, then she's thinking, I got to get home. I'm not going to fight off this giant right now. I'm the mom. If I die in a fight, that's it. The honeybee's like, I die in a fight. That's how I roll. And I have to maintain that presence so that my colony sisters aren't attacked by birds randomly. You know, we are ferocious when attacked. But most bees are like that, like you saw in the award-winning art, you know, they're shy. So don't be afraid of getting close, and don't feel bad when they fly away. They're just protecting themselves. And bees are really diverse when it comes to stingers. So stingers, they have a different amount of venom, you know, a different amount of pain, different length. A lot of bees, stingers can't even penetrate your skin. And then male bees don't have stingers. So you can pick up a male bee, you know, and it can't sting you. So those are safe. So, but there's a lot of layers to learn. But I would say, like, don't be afraid of looking closer at flowers slowly and taking pictures and sharing them on like iNaturalist or Bug Guide. And you might find out that you can learn the bees in your yard or bees in the dunes fairly quickly, looking at like the resource I gave you, or sharing those with other like insect groups.
Great, thanks. Since you mentioned the males, oh yeah, I was just gonna say to that, my phone has this function to do like super slow-mo videos, and I've had a lot of fun just like trying to take videos of bees pollinating flowers in the super slow-mo, and gotten, you know, like 1 in every 10 of them is a pretty good one. But yeah, since you mentioned males, I have a question here from Peg. Can you please say a bit about the males? That was the question.
Sure. Like birds, sometimes males can be, I say, morphologically different. So, you know, like maybe they're the showy ones at times. Sometimes they're larger, sometimes they're smaller. Either way, sometimes they look very different than the females. So some males have like special parts of their antenna. They always have one more segment than a female, but sometimes that segment can be funny shaped and used in like a ritual courtship. Sometimes the antennae are used in mating. They'll use their antenna to, you know, stroke the antenna of the female. So just like birders can get very excited about courtship calls between birds and different flight patterns that show, you know, the hummingbird's doing this dive and doing this whistle because it's guarding territory to meet a female or whatever, you know, this is what's happening here, folks. You know, there's stuff going on like that with bees. And so on the dunes, I know, there are, for the silver dune bee, when the females emerge, they haven't mated yet. They've never even seen the daylight before, okay? They've been waiting over the winter. You know, their mother provisioned for them last year, and then they developed into adult bees and waited till spring and came out. And then the males have emerged first, and they're waiting to find the female to mate with her. So they're what's called like a mating ball. They'll ball up trying to be the first one to mate with her. And until she mates, all the males around will try to be the one to do that. And so that's quite an activity to watch out in the dunes, you know, because there's it's a little bit of a frenzy and a lot of bees in the same area at the same time, rather than one bee going to a flower, you know, flowers and going back to her nest. It's a lot of males out at that time, and a lot of females when they're all emerging pretty much close to the same time. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stories. It really just depends on the species, you know, of bee, you know, because each species can be really different.
Thank you. We have one question from Thomas. It says, I've seen big blooms down south without enough pollinators to do the job. How are the flowers pollinated if not by pollinators? And why are all the colorful flowers in receptive parts?
Well, yeah, flowers, plants, they have a diverse set of breeding systems. And so it's a big answer. There's a lot of books written about plant breeding systems, more than about bees, I would have to say. So some plants can be self-pollinated. Some plants require pollen from a different individual. Some plants will make seeds without being pollinated. You know, and some plants may bloom and not make any seeds at all. You know, so because they're not, you know, pollinated by bees. There are other pollinators other than bees. There are orchids that are, you know, that are just pollinated by a specific species of wasp, and they produce a chemical, like a volatile organic chemical that makes the wasp think its little insect prey is inside the flower. You know, there's you know, plants that you know, are pollinated by flies, et cetera, et cetera. So but I'd say, but the best answer to your question, without going too far down that road, is that if it takes you know, 25 or 30,000 honeybees to pollinate an acre of apples, and you go out there and you see the apples being pollinated, you'll say, wow, this honeybees, a lot of honeybees. If you don't have the honeybees there, it takes about 250 mason bees, because they're about, you know, so less, you know, so many less bees, and they fly faster. They have to visit like what, you know, only once, you know, for 100 times of a honeybee visit. So they're probably going to do it when it's a little cooler than a honeybee will. So if you're out there and are willing to wait 100 times longer, and when you see them like, you know, for much less of time in the flower, and then also have them look like something you didn't think was a bee because they look a lot like a fly in coloration, then you might see the pollinators doing their job. You know, it's a matter of sometimes recognizing who the pollinator is, and recognizing that if a squash bee visits a squash, wow, that squash has been pollinated 100 times more effective than one honeybee. So a lot of them don't have to be visiting as often to be as effective as the least effective pollinator, you know, which, you know, as far as bees, honeybees not being native, and many times they're not the best. There's always a better native bee for a native plant.
Thank you. Yeah, that was like slightly off topic from the bees as far as the question, but I have another one here, which is from Amy, who I think did jump off the call. She was having trouble with the audio. So sorry about that, Amy, if you get to watch this later. But her question was, what are ways to protect the bees from invasive plants? And I just immediately want to put in a plug for habitat restoration, but maybe you could speak more to that.
Yeah, the Dune ecosystem restoration team, anywhere where people are removing non-native plants, you can do a lot in your yard to plant native plants that will help. You know, for some of these bees that are small, you know, and are only having like, you know, 5 to 15, you know, progeny in that season, a small patch is a huge difference for that bee population. You know, it'll make a difference for them. So some of the best thing you can do in terms of the invasive species is planting natives and removing the invasives, for sure. I'm doing that work with it.
You started breaking up a little bit again. Just going to repeat that.
Internet is unstable, but we'll see. Are native impacted by colony collapses? Is a question I'd like to answer.
Okay, I'm going to really quickly repeat.
Are native bees impacted by colony collapse? Or is that just honeybees? Sounds like a good one to answer.
Brian, Brian, you were breaking up a little bit there. Hopefully you're still with us. I was going to repeat the answer to the last question, which was the best thing that you can do, Brian said, is remove invasives and plant natives. And Brian has jumped off the call again. So thank you for bearing with us, everybody, for these tech difficulties. Really appreciate it. I understand people got to jump off. We already lost some people here. There were a few questions that didn't get answered necessarily. I'm going to do my best to follow up with Brian with some emails about that. And see if we can't get that information from Brian and send it in an email. So thank you so much, everybody. So sorry, Brian's texting me as we speak. So thanks for being here. I hope that you'll join us next week for our talk about coastal dune vulnerability and sea level rise and climate change. It's going to be a really good talk with Dr. Ian Walker. So, Brian is jumping back on now, I think, if people do want to stick around to hear those last couple answers, but totally understand if you need to jump off. We're about at 8:12 right now. So I'm going to hang out for a minute and just see if we can get Brian back on here. And for those questions that did get unanswered or that got cut off, we'll do our best to get those answers out to folks. Okay, I'm not sure how much time we'll spend waiting for Brian, but
it's interesting. Natalia's question, do we have bees that produce salty honey? That would be a concept.
yeah, that is an interesting one. Not sure of the answer to that. I know that it really depends on what kind of plants they're getting their pollen from. And I think a lot of these solitary native bees don't produce honey at all because they're not living in a hive. So, but yeah, interesting question. And then there was another one from Jessica. Are bees attracted to brightly colored clothing? And I don't know the accurate answer to that either. I know that bees definitely have different vision than we do. They can see like UV lights and stuff. Well, we still have a couple folks hanging out with us. Brian is texting me about trying to reconnect. No. Okay, well, more people are dropping off. So thanks everybody for being with us. Really appreciate it. Hope that you can join us again next week. And before I log off, what I'm going to do is take some screenshots here and make sure I get these questions. So thank you, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Bye.
Than writing it down.
Okay, I think I might have just messed up the recording a little bit, but all right, everybody. So Brian's back and I'm going to ask him this other question that we didn't get answered. Are native bees impacted by the colony collapses, or is that just the honeybees?
Yeah, well, if I move forward saying, look, no one really owns the term colony collapse disorder, I will say that, while most of our native bees in North America here, there's 4,000, there's about 50 species of bumblebees approximately that, most of those are colony forming, so they make a colony. And so those are the ones that, if you had a collapse, they have colonies to collapse. And are they being impacted? Yeah, our continental bumblebee species are in a lot of them are in danger. So we have the only continental endangered species act protected bee is the rusty patch bumblebee, and that's found in the Midwest. But what's been proposed here in California are multiple species for protection, both by the Fish and Wildlife Service and which is Bombus franklini, a Klamath endemic, Klamath siskiyou endemic bumblebee species, as well as our western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis. So Bombus occidentalis, the western bumblebee, was the most common bumblebee. 20 years ago, 9 out of 10 bumblebees you saw, typically were the western bumblebee. And that includes whether you're in British Columbia or, in
Okay, you started freezing again. Bummer. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I'm going to pause this recording.